Welcome back. This is Dr. Vermilio. In this lecture, we'll discuss experimental designs for diagnostic accuracy studies. And we're going to study this in the context of auditory processing disorders. All right, for this discussion, auditory processing disorder, APD, central auditory processing disorder, CAPD, and central in parentheses, auditory processing disorder, or C in parentheses, APD, are considered equivalent. And you can see all of these terms in the literature. A diagnostic accuracy study is used to determine the validity of a diagnostic test. A diagnostic system is used to determine the ability of a test to correctly identify the presence and absence of a target disorder. A diagnostic system includes the index test, or the test under evaluation, the target disorder, also called the clinical entity, and the reference or gold standard test. The highly controversial area of auditory processing disorders allows for a very interesting discussion of diagnostic accuracy studies. An auditory processing disorder, we just mentioned it's called by these three different terms. So right away, by looking at these three different terms, you got to think, why are there three different terms, and why does one term or a couple of terms include central? Why is central in parentheses? How come central is missing from the first term? And the reason is that the first papers to come out, the first, in quotes, consensus statements that came out from the experts, is that they called it central auditory processing disorder. Now, this is related to the early research that showed that certain tests, certain behavioral tests, can be sensitive to the presence of a lesion in the auditory cortex. So that's why it was called a central auditory processing disorder. But then a later consensus statement, in a later consensus statement, the authors said, you know what, an auditory processing disorder could also be due to something in the periphery, meaning a problem in the cochlea. So let's just eliminate that term central. And then another consensus group came up and said, you know what, we actually really didn't like that word central, so we're going to bring it back, but we're sort of going to bring it halfway there. We're going to sort of devalue the term central, and we're going to put it in parentheses. So that's why we're going to put that term in parentheses. So already you can see just from this little history of the terms that there's a lot of confusion about this disorder. The literature on APD is quite confusing. However, here is a relatively simple explanation of the APD construct, and this is based on the guidelines from the American Academy of Audiology, published in 2010. So here's the simple explanation. So if you were tasked with telling somebody, answering the question, what is an auditory processing disorder? You can say this: tests with known sensitivity to the presence of a lesion of the central auditory pathways, such as a brain tumor, are also sensitive to an auditory processing disorder in the absence of that central lesion. That's it in a nutshell. So if you're asked, what is an auditory processing disorder? Well, you can say tests with known sensitivity to the presence of a lesion of the central auditory pathways are also considered sensitive to an auditory processing disorder. So if an individual exhibits poor performances on these tests, then we're going to say that they have an auditory processing disorder. So this is the construct in a very simplistic term or terms. So the diagnostic of an APD, according to the guidelines from the American Academy of Audiology, is simple. A patient is given a battery of tests, so a number of behavioral tests, with known sensitivity to a central auditory lesion. If the patient scores 2 standard deviations below the mean for any 2 of these tests, then the patient has an APD. And so that's it in a nutshell. However, the implications of an APD diagnosis are not clear. There is no standardization for the APD test battery, and there is no way to confirm or validate the presence of an APD in the absence of a central auditory lesion. And as you would guess, this is highly problematic. So according to the guidelines from AAA 2010, several lines of evidence have accumulated over the last 50 years, definitively establishing CAPD as a true clinical disorder. On the other hand, the policy from an insurance company called Aetna on auditory processing disorders stated this: the reported frequent co-occurrence of auditory processing disorder with other disorders affecting listening and or spoken language comprehension suggests that APD is not, in fact, a distinct clinical entity. Well, that's interesting. So what's a clinical entity? The first time I read this, I had no clue what they were talking about. It's like, what's a clinical entity? And I asked a physician friend of mine, I said, so what does the term clinical entity mean to you? And he said, oh, do you mean like a clinic or a hospital? And I thought, no, that's probably not what a clinical entity is. And I looked all over the literature. I was doing all these searches over a span of a few years, trying to find a definition for the clinical entity. And lo and behold, alas, I found a definition for the clinical entity using the Google search engine. This is from August 20th of 2019. And I found this definition: a clinical entity is a disorder that is diagnosed and treated, general definition. And look at the hits here. So the term clinical entity was found in 1,180,000 results or sites. So the algorithm that Google uses for their to find definitions, out of over 1 million results, they chose this as the definition. So this is really interesting. It also looked very familiar. It says down here, application of a medical definition of the clinical entity. And this is the North Carolina Speech, Hearing, and Language Association. And if you click on this document, you'll find it's actually my handouts from a talk I gave to this at this NICSLA conference. So I thought, great. So I'm spending all this time looking for a definition. I can't find one. So I create a definition based on my reading of the literature in medicine. And then this gets posted on the web, and this becomes the definition that Google comes up with. That's really fascinating. So a clinical entity is a disorder that is diagnosed and treated. And this is the general definition that I came up with, that's really based on the writings of these great physicians. And you can read more about the clinical entity in my paper called On the Clinical Entity in Audiology, Central, in parentheses, Auditory Processing, and Speech Recognition and Noise Disorder. So I discussed the work of Dr. Thomas Sydenham, who's considered the father of British medicine. He was a contemporary of John Locke, the philosopher who influenced Thomas Jefferson in the writing of the Declaration of Independence. So Dr. Sydenham stressed the importance of unambiguous, meaning only one meaning, descriptions of disease and homogeneous patient groups. He stated nature in the production of disease is uniform and consistent. And I also based my paper on the clinical entity on another paper called On the Clinical Entity by Dr. Otto Ernst Gutentag. This paper gives a systematic approach for the identification of legitimate disorders. And let me give you a little bit of the backstory. Dr. Gutentag was a Jewish physician who lived in Germany during the rise of Hitler. And in 1933, his supervisor told Dr. Gutentag, I'm joining the Nazi party, but because you're part Jewish, you need to leave. So Dr. Gutentag left Germany, the year that Hitler rose to power and became a physician, or rather a professor of the philosophy of medicine at UC San Francisco. And then he did the unthinkable. He joins the US Army. So here he is in his Army uniform during the time of World War II, and he serves at Normandy. So here's this German Jewish physician wearing an American Army uniform, and he's serving at the Battle of Normandy, also called D-Day. And this should be made into a movie. Anyway, the next thing that happens is, of course, the war is won by the Allies, and during the denazification process that occurred in Germany, the physicians, well, let me back up a little bit. 10% of the German civilian population became Nazis during World War II. Only 10%. But 50% of the physicians became Nazis. So during the denazification process in Germany, any physician who was a member of the Nazi Party was prevented from teaching in the medical schools. Well, now here's all these medical schools, and they're missing a whole bunch of professors, right? They're missing a large amount of their faculty. So the German medical school establishment came to the US military government in place in that sector of Germany at the time and said, hey, could you guys help us out here? Could you send somebody over to rehabilitate the German medical schools? And the American military government asked Dr. Gutentag if he would be the guy to head up the rehabilitation of the German medical schools, which I think is an amazing story. This is an amazing story. So so Dr. Gutentag, during this time, he decided to put his thoughts together on how does a physician determine when a disorder is legitimate? When is it a clinical entity? So he wrote this paper on the clinical entity. So in my paper from 2014, I put together what I'm calling the Sydenham-Gutentag Criteria for the clinical entity. And this is derived from the writings of Sydenham, from Gutentag, and from a very interesting paper from the Food and Drug Administration. So here are the criteria. 1, the clinical entity or legitimate disorder must possess an unambiguous definition, meaning there can only be one meaning. You can't have multiple meanings for the clinical entity. It must represent a homogeneous patient group where everyone in that patient group has some characteristic pertaining to the disorder that's the same across all patients. The clinical entity must represent a perceived limitation in the life of the patient. It must facilitate or make easy diagnosis, and it must facilitate intervention. So these are the criteria for the clinical entity. I applied these criteria to an auditory processing disorder, and you can read about that in my paper if you haven't already read it. And I also applied it to a disorder called a speech recognition and noise disorder. So here's the Sydenham-Gutentag criteria for the identification of a clinical entity. You start off with an unambiguous definition. It must define a homogeneous patient group. It must represent a perceived limitation for the patient. It must facilitate diagnosis, and it must facilitate intervention. And in this method of reasoning from Sydenham and Gutentag, we see clarity from the inception of the disease, from the conceptualization of the disease through intervention. This is a coherent, logical, and well-organized, easy to understand method of reasoning. And the clinical entity is one of the key components of a diagnostic system. And these ideas are discussed further in my papers on diagnostic accuracy and audiology that was published in 2016, a controversial paper called The Gold Standard in Auditory Processing, published in the Perspectives of the ASHA Special Interest Groups. I also encourage you to get a hold of a rebuttal to this paper called the gold standard in auditory processing disorders by leaders in the field of auditory processing disorder. This includes Dr. Shermack, Dr. Iliadou, who's a physician and an audiologist, Dr. Bamio, and Dr. Music. Dr. Shermack and Dr. Music are leaders in the United States. Dr. Iliadou is a leader in auditory processing disorders in Europe, and Dr. Bamio, of course, is in England. So they wrote a rebuttal to my paper called The Gold Standard in Auditory Processing Disorder, and then I wrote a response to their letter to the editor. So it's a lively discussion, if you get a chance, you should read these. Okay, so let's talk about the basics of diagnostic accuracy. So one question I asked was, how do we know when a disorder is legitimate? And then the other question I was wondering, or I was asking was, how do we determine the diagnostic accuracy of our tests that we use in the speech and hearing? And the area of diagnostic accuracy research goes back to the development of radar around the time of World War II. So that's why you see this radar antenna in front of you, and you see this Nazi aircraft in front of you. Okay, so our index test, now again, this is all, this is the basis of diagnostic accuracy studies used in medicine, chemistry, radiology, and in speech and hearing, okay? So we have a radar test, and our radar is actually the index test, or the test under evaluation. And the radar includes an antenna that emits an electromagnetic pulse that goes up into the air. It comes in contact with the aircraft, and as the electromagnetic pulse is emitted into the air, we see it show up on the radar screen. This is called the radar pulse, or they also called it the main bang. And then when the electromagnetic waves are reflected off of the aircraft, they go back to the antenna, and then you see this little thing called the radar pip. And this is an indication of the presence of aircraft. In other words, we can say that this is a positive index test result for the presence of the target condition, which is the presence of aircraft, right? So if you're the radar operator and you saw this on the radar screen, would you be willing to report the presence of an aircraft? And if you said, yeah, I'm going to report the presence of the aircraft, well, here's the situation. The positive test result on our index test could be from aircraft, or it could be from a cumulus cloud. So would you be willing to report that the enemy is present when actually it's just a cloud? So we need to have some sort of referee to make a decision as to whether this positive test result is true or false. We need to use a reference standard to independently verify the presence of the target condition. And here's the reference standard that they used in England. This was these guys are from the Royal Observer Corps, and this was the reference standard for the diagnostic accuracy of radar systems used during the wars. So these gentlemen would look up into the air, notice that they have communication headphones, here's a microphone, and they would look for the aircraft, and they'd say, yes, the radar results are correct, the aircraft is present, or no, the radar results are incorrect, the aircraft is not present, okay? So these are the guys that are going to tell us if the results from the index test are true or false. So now we have our diagnostic system. We have the index test, we have the target condition, we could call this the clinical entity, and the reference standard. In a diagnostic accuracy study, we determine if an index test result, positive or negative, is true or false. In other words, we determine the ability of the index test to correctly identify the presence and absence of a target condition or target disorder. So here is our index test. The radar, we see the radar screen. The index test says the target is present, so we see the little pip on the screen. So this indicates that the aircraft is present. And then we turn to our reference standard, the Royal Observers, and we ask them, hey, is this correct? Is the target condition actually present? And they say, they look up in the air, they see the aircraft, and they say, yeah, it is present. So what is this result? Is this positive test result from the index test a true positive result or a false positive result? And so hopefully you said it's a true positive result because the presence of the aircraft was confirmed by our reference standard test. And know this, the word sensitivity, it's just the percentage of true positive results in a diagnostic accuracy study. So if we found that a certain test correctly identified 90% of the research subjects with a known disorder, then we would say that the sensitivity of that test is 90%. And that's a very good ability of the test to detect the presence of the target disorder or target condition. Okay, so now what if we had this? What if the index test said that the target is present, and then so that's a positive test result. We want to know, is this a true positive or false positive test result? The reference standard, our observers look up into the air and they say, actually, we don't see aircraft in the sky, all we see are clouds. So they're telling us the target is absent. The index test is saying the target is present. So is this positive test result true or false? And of course, you should answer false. It's false. The positive test result telling us that the target condition is present is actually a false positive test result. Okay, now what if the index test says the target is absent? And so this is a negative test result. So the test was negative for the presence of the disorder. The reference standard says, yeah, actually that's correct. The target is absent. So now we know that this index test result, this negative test result from the index test, is a true negative result. And know this, that the term specificity refers to the percentage of true negative results in a diagnostic accuracy study. So if 70% of the individuals without the disorder were correctly identified by negative test results on the index test, then we would say that the sensitivity of the index test, or excuse me, the specificity of the index test was 70%. Okay, so that's how that works. Now the next condition, the index test says the target is absent, so that's a negative test result. The reference standard, on the other hand, says, you know what, that's incorrect. The target is actually present. So if the reference standard says that the target condition is present and the index test says the target condition is absent, then the index test result is a false negative result. Okay? How about this condition? What if the index test says the target is present? This is a positive test result. And, well, wait a minute, we don't have a reference standard. There is no reference standard. So is this a true positive test result, or is this a false positive test result? Well, we actually don't know. When no reference standard exists, the diagnostic accuracy or validity of an index test is unknown. So there's no way to determine if this is a true positive result or a false positive result. In other words, there is no way to determine the validity of the index test result. Okay, so that's the end of our lecture on experimental designs for diagnostic accuracy studies and auditory processing disorder. In the next lecture, we'll go through part 2 of this discussion.